My connection to the Holocaust is one that's kind of a mid-career sort of debut of sorts, and I've always been fascinated with the psychology of history, basically. And so whenever I would teach my courses on social psychology, I would come into that discussion, I would come into that fascination by looking at what explained, these catastrophes like the Holocaust and other major historical events. And I was interested often about the victim experience. Certainly about perpetrators, what's happening on a collective sort of scale. Why did propaganda work the way it did in the Nazi era, that sort of thing. And more recently, I've been lucky enough to teach on the Holocaust abroad in places like Austria and Slovakia. But then, again, mid-career, discovered these testimonies, these photographs of soccer players playing in ghettos and camps, and just became further captivated by that. So that's kind of been my entry point into this history. It's increasingly an interdisciplinary sort of endeavor, and I've been very grateful to colleagues in history who've welcomed me as a social scientist to this question. So yeah, that's how I come to this. So when we think about how the disciplines of history and psychology go together, psychology is often asking the questions at the individual level. So for me, and really, like I said, my entry point into this was asking questions about how did we get where we ended up with this history? Why did the Holocaust happen? And psychology adds that very individual, but also group sort of perspective. So for instance, some of the earliest questions that psychologists and psychiatrists were asking is, why did the perpetrators do what they did? How do we explain that in a reasonable way using theory, using research? We're also asking questions about those kind of in the periphery or as observers. So bystanders, collaborators, these are often the classic categories. We've recognized now more recently those are very gray areas. Somebody could be simultaneously a victim and potentially a collaborator, depending on the country they lived in their encounter with the Nazi war machine. And so for me, it's these questions using the tools of psychology, research, theory. So we're asking questions again about perpetrator behavior, victim behavior. We're interested in socialization, how that plays a role, the very basic processes of in-group, out-group sorts of behavior. This is the classic kind of endeavor of social psychology. How do we explain people in extreme situations, but also in more normative as well? This, for me, has been the access point for my students. We can't just see the Nazi phenomenon as an exotic evil. We have to recognize that we can see ourselves in this if we look carefully. Often, especially historians, they've looked at the ordinary human being in these extraordinary situations, and that's really, I think, where psychology adds the most. How do we explain what seems like just madness? How do we explain that in more ordinary terms, ordinary theories, ordinary research? Yeah. The same processes that we see in play in Europe during the war, during the Nazi movement and its rise, and then its movement towards genocide, we're seeing similar processes here. And in fact, you'll see this in this wonderful documentary that oftentimes the Nazis are borrowing from American laws, American policy regarding eugenics, regarding immigration. The fact that we did admit, I think, nearly 250,000 refugees during the war is admirable and notable, but there's recognition that hundreds of thousands, if not millions more, could have come if there had been a shift. So some of the same pressures regarding discrimination, views about the Jewish people and so on, these are the same pressures that the average German would have been exposed to as well. That's been a wonderful, I think, outcome of not only the exhibit that was at the Holocaust Museum regarding America and the Holocaust, but also this new documentary. How do we look at these processes? How do we look at the political figures at the center of it? Activist groups who are trying to rally for more open border policy, this sort of thing. So these issues are still with us, right? We're recognizing this even in our own era. Attitudes about the stranger, the perceived other, this sort of thing. That for me is another access point for my students, and I'm really excited to see this documentary get in front of them here in the coming weeks, so they can draw those parallels between the history 80 years ago and what we're seeing in our own political discourse today. It's remarkable that in some cases, as the old cliche goes, history repeats itself. It's different, and it's not exactly the same, but some of those same issues are there front and center. anticipating how viewers might react to this when they witness the atrocities, the horrors of not only the war, but of course the genocide, the Holocaust. There's also another term, by the way, that we use for this. This is Shoah, and it's really interesting when you look at the differences between those terms. I think that gets unpacked a little bit in the film. But the reason why that matters, I think, to contemporary audiences, to us nowadays, is that in as much as we might see echoes of the past today, it still gives us a pretty firm reminder, even an encouragement to recognize that people in these contested times, in these contentious times, they're still making individual choices just as we do today. So we ought not view them with that critical eye that had they been more enlightened, they would have made different choices. We're still captive to the same forces, as I was saying earlier. And so I think the modern viewer, the modern audience will see that those individual choices are still ones we can make today. We can choose to be a welcoming democracy that wrestles with the difficulties of what that means even today, recognizing that the same questions were being asked of our grandparents essentially, right? And so I'm really excited about this new look about America's response. It's a complicated one, it's an ugly one. We don't always come out looking great in this history. And even today, the criticisms we get from our international partners and even adversaries are ones that are echoed by the same time or in the same time 80 years ago. So I'm excited about it. I think it gives us a chance to choose differently going forward. Again, we don't always get it right nowadays. We've had a lot of tragedies, frankly, on our own southern border. But it gives us a chance to get it right. I think we need multiple chances in that regard. I really do. So even though I am a teacher with a pretty busy teaching schedule, my university and just my own interests, my own freedoms really have opened up a rather undiscovered part of Holocaust studies that certainly I think is in the wheelhouse, so to speak, of psychological kind of theory and interpretation, that sort of thing. But I kept coming across, in my preparations for my teaching, I kept coming across testimonies and even photographs. There's one photograph in particular that I'll talk about that begged the question, why was this happening in a place, camps, ghettos, that were meant to destroy people, meant to humiliate them, to ostracize them, and ultimately, in many cases, murder them. One photograph in particular was taken early on in the Nazi regime as they were developing their concentration camps. This was at Dachau, just outside of Munich. And there are these shoeless, semi-clothed men who were clearly prisoners kicking a ball about. And it ultimately was a propaganda photo, but it just begged the question, why was this happening? And as you dig more and more into this history, you realize that initially historians were not necessarily interested in these questions of prisoner responses related to sport and so on. I think it was seen even by the prisoners as something they didn't want to talk about, because if they happened to survive, people would ask them, okay, you seem to have it good here. Maybe it wasn't as bad as we heard, right? So there was a little bit survivor's guilt, but something beyond that as well. So these questions weren't being asked. We learned a lot about cultural responses, poetry, literature, art in a lot of the camps, but soccer or sport tended to be marginalized. And so these stories started to come out in testimonies in the 90s, 2000s, shockingly late, really, because we're talking 40, 50 years after the end of the war. And one breadcrumb led to another, basically. And so as I come across more testimonies, get them translated in some cases for the first time or more fully for the first time, I started to cobble together some stories. And so the best known stories were the ones of a camp in Czechoslovakia, where very notable Jews of cultural or societal importance were sent, what they called them in the language of the day, Jews who would be missed, right? These were stories that were well known, very well known. Soccer league, thousands of people played, including children. There were organized leagues with referees and all that. But then that story led to many others in places like Ukraine, Poland. Soccer emerged. Again, it was the sport from the 1930s on that was wildly popular, increasingly so, and it explains why it's the #1 sport around the world even to today. Um, but the Nazis also were aware of this, and so initially they tried to use it as a propaganda tool. The Italian fascist Mussolini did the same thing using World Cup and Olympic Games, and so there's this dark side to it as well. But quite often, sport in the memoirs and the testimony, soccer especially, was a means of survival. Sometimes these prisoners got extra rations, extra protection, and so many of them talked about the fact that had they not played or had the fame, pre-war fame from being an athlete, they might not have survived. And so these were stories that just captivated me. And each place I'm able to talk about this with student audiences, conferences, that kind of thing, people just they say, "Gosh, we didn't know this. Where were these stories, years ago?" And so I've been grateful for it. I've noticed this in my travels as well. We took a student group to Guatemala to study genocide there from the 1980s. And we brought a lot of very durable soccer balls to pass out to impoverished communities. And it's always fascinating to me when you roll a ball out in a public square, people will gather around it, especially kids. And so soccer for me, and this has been true from a young age, it's a great equalizer. It breaks down barriers. I firmly believe it's one of these pathways to teach this history, but just to bring people together. Like I said, it's a leveling force, and people have written much about this internationally. So for me, I'm kind of joining that moving stream, basically. So I've got a playing and a coaching background, and for younger audiences, even the youngest ones, 6, 7, 8 years of age, again, you have to be very careful about how you talk about this history, but they're often, again, fascinated by this. They may not need a lot of background information to understand the basic motivation of joy and pleasure in playing a sport, and then you couple that with the awful history of Nazi occupation and atrocity. Again, you walk a fine line, but it helps them gain an entry point to a history that might seem remote and very distant. We're at that end. We're getting close to the end of the era of the survivor, the firsthand witness, and so these stories, I think, will carry that forward. In the afterword of my book, basically, I talk about why so many people see soccer as this inspirational force. There's a survivor who taught it. I think it was American University in Washington, D.C., played when he was a young man during the Nazi era in several camps. And he describes soccer, again, it's known as the beautiful game, but it's a way to inspire. It's a way for even the youngest to understand the human spirit is still there, even when it's being persecuted. Unless there's a reason for researchers of any sort, historians, psychologists, sociologists, whoever they might be, to track down some of these stories, they could be lost to history. They're going to be residing in archives. Somebody needs a reason to go find them. I don't think we would lose them altogether. What I do think is happening, and this relates, I think, to the documentary, but also the mandates that you see across a number of states in the US, that there's a sense of urgency, partly driven by the fact we're losing the witnesses. The survivors are passing away. Those who are with us now were younger children, and so there are always interesting aspects to that in terms of recollection and memory and that sort of thing. Not to question that necessarily, but we recognize that there's an urgency here. And so some of it is also in response to cultural dynamics in our own time. For many, in 2017, when we see the far-right march in Charlottesville, Virginia, that was a wake-up call. There was a time where we tend to have anti-Semitic actions in Jewish cemeteries, Jewish centers, schools, and so on. There's kind of a low ebb of that for a time, but we see an uptick in that, and it often follows cultural shifts related to economics, political movements, this sort of thing. So when that happens in Charlottesville, it gets a lot of people's attention. People lost their lives in that era as well, or I shouldn't say era, but in that time as well. So urgency of all sorts, cultural shifts, the loss of this memory, this living memory, the rise in anti-Semitism that we see pretty stridently. We see that in Europe. There have been some pretty horrendous attacks in churches in Europe as well. So collectively, people who are in the advocacy role, but also the historical, political role, they're seeing that sense of urgency. And I see that in my classes as well. Students are asking these questions. Why is this happening? They may not know much about Jewish history or even history from the middle to early 20th century. And so we can talk about preconditions. We can talk about the long history of what they call the longest hatred, anti-Semitism. And so there's a timeliness to it for sure. And this documentary will, I think, bring that to a very fine point to help us understand why now. The motivation, the movements across different states of all sorts, whether they're in the Northeast, the American South, or other parts of the country, we're often responding also to surveys, but also kind of the fund of knowledge that students will have. And so oftentimes these surveys, when they're done really well, they reveal just a real dearth of knowledge, straight up ignorance in many cases. You can hardly fault students for this because there are so many competing pressures for what is being taught and what should be taught. But this is a way, again, for us to recognize that there's just, again, the farther you get away from the history, people just don't know it. I often say that we could very easily be talking about Civil War history in as much as we are talking about World War II history. It just seems, like I said, remote to so many, especially if they're in middle school and high school now. So we've got to find ways to tie it into what they're already learning, not to make this an onerous burden to teachers. When they hear the word mandates, I don't necessarily think they're going to be put off by it, but they're going to say, oh, how do I do this? And so that's where those of us who care passionately about teaching this stuff want to fill that gap, and that's already happening nationally, but also in the state. A number of really fantastic folks working on curriculum development. The State Department of Education is working on professional development days for teachers. And so the committee I'm on here in Northwest Arkansas, again, which I joined well into its formation, has offered annually a conference for students especially to try to fill those gaps. And we've been doing that now for 28 years. Some really fantastic people who started that as educators decades ago now. We want to keep that river flowing, basically. When we look at what's lacking maybe in a student's education, we might find gaps here and there, but particular to this history, as with many states, frankly, we don't show well. Arkansas doesn't show well. Not an indictment necessarily of the teachers or the system necessarily, but it's part of what's, I think, missing more broadly as we think about what it means to be or to educate citizens of the world. How do we help them see beyond themselves? We want to also tie this history to what they care about. This is why books like Anne Frank's diary are always top sellers, because younger readers, they see themselves in these stories. Graphic novels have been a boon for this history as well. It's a way, again, for students to access what might seem like a dry history. So in as much as we've got a lot of work to do, there's a really great momentum right now, and many of us are trying to further that and advance that as best we can. The state Department of Education is really taking the lead on this, using not only existing resources, but trying to curate them in such a way that it feels manageable for teachers as they step into this requirement for the next few years. What I'm seeing as part of museum fellow, although I'm not one, but museum fellow, but also like-minded, collaborating sort of educators, is that we're heading all in the same direction. We're kind of rowing all in the same direction. And so these resources that will be available will be very matched by lesson plan, by grade level. It's very much matched to the educational requirements and demands. And so in as much as there are great numbers of resources regarding testimonies, diaries, video, even audio, and of course photographic evidence, a lot of it, much of it, is being carefully examined so that it matches the sensibilities and needs of particular classroom, particular teachers, so they can often fold it into units that they're already teaching, so it doesn't feel like another add-on. And so the state is very mindful of that, and they're bringing together experts from sort of the teaching community, secondary, even lower levels, and then university and some of the research minded folks across the state. So it's really remarkable how quickly this has come together. The movement to get the bill passed was years in the making, for sure. But then the next question immediately was, how do we do this? How do we make it accessible? What should be taught? And there has been a general consensus on answering that question based on not only the expertise, but what teachers we estimate will need and want. And that's where, again, people like Ricky are speaking into this. Ricky has taken the lead in developing this curriculum. So ideal candidate to do this kind of work, basically. But it is remarkable, without being too self-promoting here. So many people are speaking into this process, and I feel really good having seen what the curriculum will look like, that it's going to hit all the marks, not only in terms of the national standards that are being recommended because so many states are moving in this direction, but also the in-classroom sort of needs. How do you choose a memoir? How do you choose a testimony that's relatable to your students, appropriate for their grade level, but also matches the unit that you're on? And so that's happening and will be rolled out here in the coming months. Our committee is actually committed to offering workshops for teachers. Some of this may happen virtually or through the usual electronic means, but we're looking to fill that in the summer. So we're all kind of catching up to what is a rapidly developing curriculum. What I loved is that even if you have a decent knowledge of the Holocaust, you're going to walk away from this film over its 3 days, its 3 evenings, with a deeper sense of what the American response was in terms specifically of those individual stories. This is what Ken Burns and his team are so good at. What do the diaries tell us? You'll often see photography that I've never seen before, and I've seen a lot of it, illustrating the American response in terms of resisting the Nazi messaging, but also those who were lined up with the Nazi messaging, the American Nazis. A lot of people have no idea about that. A gathering of nearly 20,000 people in Madison Square Garden, that's going to be one of the, I think, highlights of this film, as dark as it is. People will realize there was a Nazi movement in this country. Fascism had its appeal internationally, and America was not immune to that. And also the pressures of keeping essentially a closed door policy once the war starts, and the perception of threat that overlaps with our own treatment of Japanese Americans. I think maybe a lot of students in Arkansas don't know that we had 2 of these internment camps in the southeast part of the Delta in Arkansas. Honestly, I didn't know that until I moved here, and I felt like I knew this history well. So there'll be some eye-opening moments, I think, in this film. Those are just a couple of examples that'll be, I think, pretty poignant and remarkable. I think for some, the initial question will be, the Holocaust didn't happen here. Why are we talking about it through the American sort of experience? When you visit the museum in DC, one of the first exhibits you'll see, the first photography you'll see, are of the liberators, right? So our grandparents as liberators, and why so many of them, when they came back from the war, simply couldn't talk about this history. So if there's anything that's left out, and again, I want to be careful here because there are certainly some remarkable experts. In fact, just as an aside, my first teacher in Holocaust studies is the first expert that features on the film, Peter Hayes from Northwestern. Profound impact on me as someone coming from another discipline. So I lit up when I saw him. He was kind enough to write a little blurb for my book a few years ago. But I think for a lot of Americans who maybe have just a passing interest or exposure to the Holocaust, it's going to be that question: why should I care about this? Why is this an American story? So that's where I would start with that. Convince me maybe why I should care about this. And not that I would be callous to it as a viewer, but maybe there's a little Holocaust fatigue out there. You sometimes hear that, and sometimes that's the entry point for more horrendous things like denialism, revisionist history. That's often an entry point for them to minimize why this history matters. And so this American angle, I think, matters tremendously. As it happens, I'll be in Washington, D.C. as part of an educators conference on this very issue. I was lucky enough to be added to the roster of learners, of students, and we'll be watching it as a group, as a cohort of educators. I was going to be watching it anyway, but I really want people to take the time on a Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday night to dive into a hard history, but to make themselves available to it. Quite simply, I think it matters. It's not a history that we can leave in the past. If you don't mind, actually, I've got a little thing I want to share here that I thought maybe I could wrap up with. borrowing from a very remarkable person from this era who lived through this history. So I ask my students all the time, what would you have done in these circumstances? We often wrestle with this tendency to look down on those who came before us as if they should have known better. They should have made better decisions. Or maybe we say, I would have never done that. For me, the history of the Holocaust, when we see it, especially through the lens of the United States experience, challenges all of that. When we witness the crimes of Nazi Germany committed so long ago, I believe we can see ourselves looking back. It was the French philosopher and activist Simone Weil who reminded us, we ought not to hide from ourselves that Nazi Germany is a mirror for us all. What looks to us so hideous is our own features, but magnified. And for me, the past really isn't in the past. I think it still speaks to us now. And for me, I ask myself this question, how will I respond? I have some ideas. It's built into my teaching life, but it goes well beyond that. I think it gets at the core of what it means to be a human who hopefully seeks to be empathic, who seeks to be human, or remain human in the light of such awful history.